And I'm so sorry, I'm speaking to the camera for just a minute. I've been missing so many of you, and I really do miss it when you don't send me information, because a lot of people watch from home, they're snowbirds. So if you are watching from home, please let me know, because I would love to hear from you. We have a very difficult passage today, so feel free to climb in and tell me what you think about this. This is your very first Bible study, so get ready. We're killing firstborn baby boys today.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Probably won't cheer us up,
No.
but I hope it won't, right? That wouldn't be very healthy. But we're going to look at Exodus chapter 12. No, 11. We're going to start with chapter 11. Are we all there?
Not yet.
And those of you who are watching from home, if I don't address a question, I try to assume, but if I don't address your question, and some people do text me and let me know what's happening, but if I didn't answer your question, be sure to text me. And here we are. Now we've been through, just so you know, we've been through 9 plagues. Yeah, Cindy and I wrapped up 9 last week. Horrible, just all kinds of things. But this one is by far the worst one. And we'll start. And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring a plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. And after the plague I send him, he will let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. He's going to do it, the Pharaoh. So the writer is actually telling us that Pharaoh himself will usher the Israelites out of Egypt. Pharaoh's going to say, just this way, here you go, follow right this way. Indeed, when he lets you go, he's going to do it. He won't be able to wait another second for you to get out of his country. And notice that the Lord said, all of you will get out of here. No one will be left behind. Not the livestock, not any of the children. And of course the last ones to be considered, the women. All the women will get out of there alive. But wait, just a moment. Now we've been talking about who actually wrote these passages that we're reading. And once again, what we have here is a combination of J and E. J being the writer who calls God Yahweh, and E being the writer who calls God Elohim, or El. So these two traditions have been combined, and they're blended together so well that it's really difficult to try to find the difference between the two. But remember, chapter 10 ended with both Moses and Pharaoh agreeing to never lay eyes on each other. They decided never again. Pharaoh even threatened to kill Moses on sight, if I ever see you again. But here they are in chapter 11, meeting again on God's instructions. And God continues to give Moses instructions for his next meeting with Pharaoh. First, Moses is to inform Pharaoh that God is planning a terrible plague. And now these instructions in verse 2. God tells Moses to tell the people, this is very strange, ready? To borrow each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers all their objects of silver and gold. It's a little unusual, very strange instructions, right? So the Hebrew word for borrow can also be translated as the word ask for. Just ask for their valuables, or even demand. Demand their valuables, gold and silver. So verse 2 is actually telling the Israelites to demand from their Egyptian neighbors all their objects that are made of gold and silver. So clearly, God is saying that the Israelites have no intention. Yahoo! The Israelites have no intention of returning these items when they come back. Welcome back. We are so glad to see you.
Well, thanks.
Did you get your hair cut?
Uh-huh.
I like it. Good to see you.
Thanks.
So we're just, I don't know if you know Connie yet. Connie, this is Erica.
We see each other every Sunday.
And here we are getting started. We just started. We're on verse, thank you, my darling. We're on verse 2 of chapter 11. So, verse 2 tells the Israelites to demand from their Egyptian neighbors all their objects of silver and gold. So some say that this is similar to the English expression, can I borrow a match? Have you ever heard that? Can I borrow a match? Have you ever heard anything like that? You don't really hear much of that.
Borrow a match. Once it's used, it's used. You can't return it.
Exactly, right? It's sort of like saying, have you got a light? Now, I wasn't familiar with that because nobody smokes anymore, right?
Oh,
You
but
don't-
have you got a light? I do have that, but I never heard, can I borrow a match?
Can I borrow a match? Got a match?
No, I
Yeah,
never
I've heard it. I went and looked it up, yeah.
I just
Um,
heard if you got a light.
But maybe because nobody smokes much, right? Thank you, God. But this expression about borrowing a match, do you think it's the same idea that we just read in verse 2 about borrowing your neighbor's valuables? I don't think so.
No.
No.
Everyone knows that a match lit and then extinguished, it's useless, right? It would not be returned, it's trash. But the Israelites are borrowing the Egyptians' gold and silver. Now that's different. And that sounds like, I don't know, robbery or extortion, right? They're not borrowing.
It doesn't
they're-
say borrow, it doesn't say lend, it says ask her neighbors for objects of silver and gold.
But we just, before you came in, if you look at the Hebrew word, and I don't think you have Hebrew there, is that, do you have Hebrew in the
No,
Bible?
No.
The Hebrew word is the same as demand, ask for. So it's not borrowing, it's demanding. And this is a very confusing verse. Do you remember we went over this before, in chapter 3? And we've heard something like this before, and we're going to read it again later in the book. So there's no doubt about it. God is very clear about it. God told the Israelites to plunder, to take their neighbors' valuables. They're going to leave the ghetto with gold. There's no doubt about it. And this does not seem to concern the rabbis over the centuries. They're not at all concerned about this. The rabbinical writings, for the most part, seem to be just fine with this. According to one midrash, midrash is an explanation that's been passed on from generation to generation. It's like interpreting, like we sit around here and we interpret what we read according to what we think. Well, according to one midrash, the Egyptians knew that the Israelites could have plundered like crazy all during that darkness plague. Remember when you were having fun? But they didn't. So when the Egyptians became aware of the moral greatness of their slaves, they just handed over all their silver and gold. Really, rabbis, does that sound right to you? No.
Do they have to? I mean, could they have said no?
Of course,
Yeah.
of course. Or, some rabbis say, is this a Torah case for reparations? For reparations.
I was gonna say, yeah, it was payment, in arrears for having done all that work for them for so long.
Well, interesting. And I think the way the modern Reformed Jewish rabbis texted this, they've been slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. So come on,
430.
give me my due. But this is how the Reformed rabbis say, that since Torah teaches that our ancestors got loot when they were freed, our responsibility as modern Jews and as members of a free society, and that's including us too, even good Lutherans like us, we are members of that same free society. So we have a responsibility also, and our social responsibility is to ensure that that same loot is available for those who have been plunged into economic subordination. So it's not just us assuming that we should get it and share it with those who don't have it. We owe others. And that kind of sounds very Torah to me, right? So, when a used to be poor person comes to your house and asks you for your gold and silver, you should just give it away to them, right? It's only fair. It's just social justice. Now, is that what you heard? Yeah, no. But let's keep reading this and let's decide if you think J or E are actually saying that. So God continues giving Moses instructions, and I paraphrase. When you, Moses, tell everyone to get riches from their neighbors, don't worry about the Egyptians saying no to you. And you know why? Because just like God can harden Pharaoh's heart, he can also mess with Pharaoh's people, making their hearts all squishy and soft and sweet. God will dispose the Egyptians favorably toward his people. And besides this, everyone knows Moses himself was esteemed in the land of Egypt, among the Pharaoh's courtiers, among all the people. So that's what God does. He disposes the Egyptians favorably toward the Israelites, and he makes Moses a very, very popular guy in Egypt. So that when the Israelite woman is walking out of Egypt, the Egyptian neighbor will stop her and say, please, neighbor, please,
Take my boat.
please don't leave without taking all my silver, all my gold. Here, take all my valuables with you. And this will happen because Moses is such a great man. He's got charisma. He's compelling and he's charming. He's simply irresistible. And we can't forget, it says it over and over and over again in the first 5 books. Moses is the most humble man in the Torah. Just listen to him. I'm the most humble man in this. And we can't forget that because Moses spends pages and pages telling us how humble he is. You'll see. So Moses has his instructions from God. So he goes to Pharaoh and says, thus says the Lord. Around midnight, I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl, who sits behind the millstones, and all the firstborn cattle and goats and sheep, etc., shall die. And this is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. God says that he will commit genocide. And it's going to happen around midnight. And you know why it happens at midnight? So that he can be sure everyone's home. Everyone will be at home. So his plan actually guarantees maximum casualties. That sounds so horrible. That doesn't sound like my Lord and Savior.
No.
And all the Egyptians will be victims. Doesn't matter if you're rich, doesn't matter if you're a ruler or a penniless slave, even the lowly female slaves who sit and grind the grain, they will be victims.
If they're the firstborn.
Sorry?
If they're the firstborn.
If their son. It just breaks my heart. But that's
You know-
what we read here.
You know, that's true. And remember we talk about the Cecil B. DeMille movie all the time?
So which
that was-
movie?
The Cecil B. DeMille movie.
Oh,
the
right.
Ten Commandments, right? This part was so hard for Cecil B. DeMille to say that God would do this horrible thing. He made it be Pharaoh's idea in the movie. Because what happened is, because of all these plagues that your God has sent on me, Pharaoh says, I'm gonna strike down and kill the firstborn of every Israelite.
Oh,
And then Moses says, oh no, that's the plague, and that's it, that's the plague. And it was from your idea, and now God's gonna do it to all the Egyptians and not to the Israelites. And so that's how they did it in that film.
isn't that interesting?
And that's how most people in this country think that
Oh yeah,
really
because God
happened.
would never do this. You know, God would never, ever do this.
Well-
We talked about this last week. Why is God doing all these terrible things? So that people know He is the Lord, you know. But this is a little bit, so just going back to this female slave, who sits behind the millstones. Have you ever seen millstones? I did not have, I had to look this up. And I know that some of you here did you grow up on a farm?
No, but they, in Georgia, they had a lot of at Stone Mountain, they had the mill still there, they still grind cornmeal.
Oh, yeah,
And so
yeah.
we went through there.
Interesting. But here's how grinding the millstone works. So there's two stones, one on top of the other, and then the grain is placed between the two stones. And then the upper stone is a little bit smaller, and it's moved back and forth, and then across the larger stone beneath it, and the grain is crushed, and that's called milled. It's called milled. And this is boring work, but it's physically very taxing, and it's hard work, and it's usually done by the most menial slaves. So why is this particular activity cited here? It's sort of stuck right in between such a huge announcement, right? Well, the writer wants to show that no Egyptians are safe from this final plague. Menial slaves are not safe, not even the Egyptian animals are safe. And remember, we discussed earlier that the Egyptians worship cows. The cow goddess is called Hathor, and she actually, it's a she, and she looks like a cow, and she's female. And this plague actually kills firstborn males, so it's kind of confusing. Do they knock her off too? You know, because she's kind of ambidextrous, so to say. So, but bottom line, the livestock would soon become dead stock, and the death of the firstborn cattle showed all the Egyptians that the Israelites' God had power over the Egyptian gods and goddesses. So, needless to say, this plague is by far the most severe, and it presents us with several severe problems. Now, by noting that the lowly slave girl and her baby would be victims, Torah is kind of posing a problem here, right? And of course it's solved by a Hollywood producer by just changing the words of the Bible. But does this slave girl's baby deserve to die? Yeah, you know, that's a question for us, right? Like when we read this, what do we think? Because Torah does not treat this as a moral problem. Isn't that weird? This is, say the rabbis, reality. And this shows that everyone suffers under a bad ruler. So we should take that to heart. And some rabbis pose this problem this way. The Egyptian slaves were indeed powerless. So the question is, why should they be punished for something their ruler did or didn't do, right? Well, some sages say, and this rabbinical midrash, it's because these Egyptian slaves did not join with the Hebrew slaves. They didn't make common cause with them. They did not demand their freedom, and they did not intend to walk out of bondage with the Israelites. They planned on staying right where they were, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure. But it gets worse. Bad as their lives were, behind the millstones, grating and milling those grains, they took perverse pleasure and satisfaction in knowing that there were others, even worse off. Others, like the Israelites, had it harder, and that provided them comfort. And that seems rather harsh, doesn't it? That
You still have that idea that, well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so. or-
exactly,
we- I mean, we
exactly.
Still have that.
Yeah, you know, boy, do I ever know it. But did you notice when we read this, Pharaoh himself is not harmed. Not one hair on his head is harmed. Instead, it's all the babies who will pay for Pharaoh's actions. Now, does that sound
His
right to you?
firstborn son, though.
Yeah.
Sorry?
His firstborn son was killed, right?
Yeah, but we're not there yet.
Well,
We're not there yet. So who's getting punished? Babies, not Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's the one who's making these decisions. So, as you can imagine, let's just picture this. God says there will be a loud cry of anguish in all the land of Egypt. And such a cry has never been heard before, nor will it ever be again. Thank you, God, right? And God wants us to know that this cry from the Egyptians, they will be crying and moaning, not the Israelites. Because this plague, this death, is just for the Egyptians, not the Israelites. So the Egyptians will be wailing, but not a dog snarls at any of the Israelites, not a man or a beast. So of course you know my Lucy, I have the most amazing dog in the world. So of course I see this thing about a dog, I said, oh, I have to share what dogs were for the ancients, back in the day. They're not like dogs are for us, like man's best friend. No, no, no. Dogs were not kept as pets, and they were actually detested, and they were seen as disgusting scavengers, and even worse, dangerous. And this text actually translates as, and if you see it, tell me if this is what yours says, no dog will sharpen its tongue against the Israelites.
Mine says, no dog, not even one dog will bark at any person or animal.
That's what
yeah,
mine says.
but not a dog shall growl at any of the Israelites, not at people, not at animals. So that
Interesting.
you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel.
Yep. Interesting. So dogs were considered evil, hostile creatures, but not even these vile creatures, and they were wild, they weren't domesticated, not even they will bother the Israelites, but of course, very different story for the Egyptians. So why is God doing this? Well, same as always, Cindy, what we talked about last week, right?
To show.
So that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. God knows. It's a very, very harsh lesson. So God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, when I unleash this plague and kill all the firstborn in Egypt, then all your courtiers of yours shall come down to me, and they will bow down to me, and they will say, depart, depart, you and all the people who follow you. And after that, I will depart. And then Moses departed. And Moses left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. And Moses is still...
Wait, why was Moses hot angering? Because Pharaoh said no?
Well, very interesting. We're not really sure why. Some people say it's because that's why Moses had to leave way back in chapter 3, was it 2 or 3, when he ran away because he buried that guy in the sand, not permitted. We don't know. See, these stories have been combined over time. We don't know what the redactors left out. But now,
Maybe he's angry that the Pharaoh didn't listen to this?
That's what I would say too.
Yeah,
That it's
why
even-
does this have to happen?
Even at this point, he's still
But
not. using
how many times does God say to Moses, I'm hardening his heart again. I mean, I'm
Well,
gonna
that's
do
right, he did
this,
tell-
I'm gonna do all this,
Yeah,
but I'm gonna do it. Pharaoh won't listen because I won't give him the opportunity to listen. So it's almost like one hand is working against the other when it comes to Pharaoh.
But it still boils down to God showing that he is the
God.
Lord, he is
Yeah.
God.
So,
But I think he's doing it because God could have changed Pharaoh's heart and, changed it, done something different. But he chose not to because he wanted to show the Israelites, not
Oh,
so
yeah.
much the Egyptians,
both
but the
ends,
Israel.
I think both
But the,
ends.
but he wanted to show the Israelites that his power and how they needed, how because they were the chosen ones, that they were gonna be protected as long as they stuck with God, right? As long as they worshiped him and did what God wanted.
yeah, that lasted like 10 minutes.
I know. But that was, to me, that's kind of more of what it was.
And you had
Because
to
you're
get,
right,
and you had to get all those Egyptians giving up their slaves. They had to give up, so.
there had to be something really horrific to make them
Exactly.
want to get rid of their slaves and to
Exactly.
get rid of their gold. Because they didn't wanna do that, but they did it because it was like, get these guys away from me so that my children can live in peace.
Exactly. So, now the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, he will not listen to you, and that's because of me. I designed it that way for a purpose, a very important purpose, and here we go again, Cindy. In order that my marvels may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. So Moses and Aaron, we remember they had performed all these marvels, and Pharaoh saw them, and he knew about them, but he didn't listen to them. Why? Because of the Lord had stiffened the heart of Pharaoh so that he would not let the people go from his land. And God told us that this was going to happen way back when, probably chapter 3. And shortly, this horrible pronouncement will be fulfilled. Final plague. Awful. Now, before we go on, and it's really hard to go on, but not just in the text, but it will be hard to go on, but we will go on together. But before we start, I want to take an opportunity to address one of the people who wrote to me. Oh, by the way, 4donna4@gmail.com. If you have a question, just send it to me at 4donna4@gmail.com. So, this was a question I got last week. And it's a really good question, and we're gonna use that question every week. We ask, why are we studying this Old Testament? These first 5 books. We kind of have a New Testament, we have all new stories and Gospels and so on and so forth. So why are we studying this old book? Well, today we're gonna use one of these questions that one of you sent me, and we're gonna use it as our forever question. Not forever, but just for today. And the question was, do you think this Exodus is historical? Do you think the Exodus happened? So let's
That's what
just,
Peter Mill said, so.
yeah,
it must
he
be right.
changed everything. He changed everything. I gotta watch that movie. Now, did any of this really happen? Can there be any logical explanation for the plague? Are there any scientific reasons for any of the disasters? Did anything actually cause these plagues? Except for God, of course, right? So let's start with this question. And we started this. When we, and we're gonna follow the science, I hate that expression. Why was there death on the Nile, right? Now, as we looked at the first 9 plagues, we could find maybe, just a kernel, a possibility that there were reasonable and logical and maybe even scientific reasons that these things were happening all over Egypt. Maybe they're real, maybe they're possible, but we talked about living right here on the shore of the Gulf, right? And when that blood red water in the Nile popped up, we talked about that, right? When we said it could be similar to what we call red tide, right? And so possible, very possible that, now how about the biting bugs? Very natural outcome of all the dead fish and all the dead frogs and carcasses that were strewn about the banks of the Nile. And of course, bugs carry disease, so the people are stricken with diseases. And in this part of the world, sandstorms cause darkness over the land. And we've all experienced hailstorms, right? And many of you have even experienced, well, I never did, but locust infections. I can't even imagine. Must be terrifying. Do like they cover your windows?
Yeah, they can. I was just up in Illinois, and the cicadas, you know, the
Yeah,
big-
yeah.
We're walking, we went to our dinner, walked along, and all of a sudden I go, oh my. I said, is that the cicadas? And my friends from the Midwest are like, yep, that's what they are, all right.
Oh my
She says,
gosh.
they're almost gone now, and I said, oh, it's the first time I heard them in real life. I mean, I heard them on television and stuff, you know, but they're pretty loud, they're pretty loud.
Very.
And we were just walking past a little, you know, we were in a downtown area, but there was a little ravine, and there was a wooded area, and they were, you know, I mean, they were loud enough that I could hear them and say something to everybody that I was with.
And imagine if there's nothing around, just you and the cicada. I mean, that'd be terrifying, right? So, it seems reasonable to assume there are natural disasters, that not everything that happens on this planet has to do with the supernatural workings of God. But what about this 10th plague? The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, and the death of all the firstborn cattle. And how can that possibly be explained logically and scientifically?
It can't, because it's too precise. It's like surgical precision, and that part, they only can be ascribed to God, because.
Interesting. I'm wondering if you'll see this next point that I'm going to make. Does anybody else have an idea? Could,
Maybe the firstborn are obviously they're the oldest, and they are out working in the fields, or they're not at home.
interesting,
and
very
they
interesting,
caught something.
very
But,
interesting.
well, at the same time, I don't know.
Well, I had to look like everywhere. Theological scientists. There's a whole branch of them. They just want to prove everything, very logical. So here are some opinions on this last plague. And it seems that the scholarly consensus, if there is such a thing, the 10th plague is the one for which no rational explanation can be given. It's supernatural. It's
Right,
paranormal.
because of the fact of the surgical preciseness
Well,
of.
wait a
the way
second,
it
say
happens.
other scientific theologians, you know nobody agrees in this field. They say not so fast. It may have a very rational explanation. Okay, so even if this explanation is highly unlikely, see what you think. Torah says that this 10th plague would strike firstborn sons of all the Egyptians, rich, poor, free, slave, even the animals were stricken. This plague, they say, is the ultimate disaster for the Egyptians, because all the dreams and all the plans of every Egyptian family were based on the firstborn son. So very similar to what we read all through Genesis. You know, Esau and Jacob and Isaac and Ishmael and Joseph and all his brothers, right? Jacob steals the status from his brother so that he will receive a larger share of everything. And firstborn status was very, very important to the ancients, Egyptians and Hebrews. And all the other 9 plagues targeted Egyptian crops and animals. And they suffered from the discomforts of bug bites and boils and this disgusting, creepy, croaky frogs.
But did the Israelis
No.
suffer from those too?
No.
Only the Egyptians.
Not in Goshen. There was like and they got warned to stay inside, so you'll be safe. But this 10th plague, it really struck at the heart of every Egyptian family. And therefore, it's the future generations. So for sure, this is the most serious than the first 9 plagues. And didn't it seem to you that this 10th plague is sort of unconnected to the other 9? Doesn't really fit in. Well, not so fast, say some. We've learned about the conditions of the land and the crops after the 9 plagues. The rain and the hail would have left, but whatever was left in the fields, everything that was still there, was wet, right? Still wet. Very wet, as a matter of fact. And then came the locust, and you know locust. I had to look this up. So disgusting.
Nothing's
Um,
left.
Ate everything.
Nothing's left.
They eating what they found and then defecating what was left in the fields. And now the Egyptian farmers are really, really desperate. So they quickly run to the fields and gather whatever is left. Any grain that is not completely eaten by the locust, they gather that grain. And now we know that wet grain should never be placed into a silo. A giant mistake, because wet grain has to be dried in the sun. That's why you can't harvest it on certain days, or it becomes covered with mold quickly, very, very quickly. But what choice do they have, right? They run out, they grab it, so they gather the moldy, feces-covered grain, and they stick it in the silos. And we've
And
seen
ruin all the grain that they had in the silos.
yeah, which is practically already gone. Exactly right. And the Israelites built those silos for those Egyptians. That was one of the things they built. So the Egyptians will soon plan to take out that grain, mill it, and bake it right away. But we know that didn't happen because they were stuck inside. Remember? 3 full days. They couldn't go outside during
Because
the darkness plague.
Oh, the darkness plague.
So this wet, moldy grain covered in locust feces has been sitting in a dark, airless storage facility. And we all know what happens. Mycotoxins. I swear to God, I'm looking up mycotoxins. These are poisons, and they're very, very deadly. And they're produced by fungi growing on grain. So why do theological scientists think that this could answer? Why did only the firstborn?
Oh, because they
Die.
fed the firstborn because they were the ones who would get, the future
Well,
was based
say the
on-
scientists.
That's what they say.
The firstborn sons were the first ones to be fed because they were special. And they held a special status in the family. So they got the first grain offering, and they got the largest share of the grain offering. So they also got the largest share of the mycotoxins. That sort of makes sense. But what about the animals, right? Well, say the scientists, the firstborn animals are bigger than the ones born later. So they just squeeze themselves up to the troughs and dig in first, and they eat the most. So they eat a bigger share of the diseased grain. So both the firstborn of the humans and the animals scoff down all those mycotoxins. I don't know the last time you looked up don't look it up. It's
Yeah,
like,
but to be honest with you, if it was mycotoxins or if it wasn't it still is God's will. So what difference does it make? I mean,
oh,
you
was
can
it
talk-
God's will? You think God did that? I'm not sure God did that. I'm not sure.
God said he was gonna kill all those people and all those animals,
Well,
and
that's
he did
what
it.
J and E said. I'm not sure God said that. I'm not positive
Maybe it
about that.
happened and then they assumed.
Stupidity.
Yeah.
Say it again?
Stupidity.
Exactly. I don't know if I'm putting that all on God's, you know,
Is there any, what was it, several thousand years before Jesus?
this is about 14, maybe about, some people say about 1500 BCE. BCE, so this
Is there
is,
any historical records of, not
No.
all these minor things, but
No,
or even the
the
Egyptians?
archaeologists.
one person told another person.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So there's no historical.
There's nothing on the hieroglyphics on the
Of
walls
the
or the
Egyptians
things,
having
yeah.
the Israelites as their
I am
captive
gonna
for
talk about
400
that.
years.
I am gonna talk about that because there is a stela, like an engraved, but in any case, Micah talks it.
Why do you not believe that God would do this? Because you believe God is a loving and caring God and he would never kill all these people willingly, is that it? He killed all the people willingly in the flood. If you believe that,
That's a very, very, very old story that predates, and if you look at any of any civilization, the Chickaw and the Hopi and whatever organization it happens to be, it's the same story. It's
Right.
it's a different
Free will.
version.
Free will.
Yep.
You can be bad or you can be good.
No, but I mean,
It's your choice.
no, my question is, why don't you wanna believe that God did this?
Well, first of all,
Because
there's
of
no
free
hard
will, we
evidence.
choose,
Yeah.
we choose.
I just
Our-
don't
our
see
path.
God saying, all right, everybody in Egypt, firstborn, you're dead. That just isn't my Lord and Savior. That just doesn't sound like, it doesn't sound right to me.
But it's here, it's a story. Did you believe he killed everybody in the flood too?
I don't think God did that, no. I think that's a story. I think it's I don't think it's a real story. We have absolutely no proof. Of course, if you go to, what is the name of that art park? If you go to Art Park in Kentucky, you can,
Kentucky,
Yeah.
Well,
it's,
that's
we kind of made it up to
That's
figure things
marketing.
out.
it's marketing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Very, very, very interesting. So,
In another
oh.
Bible study, I was told that the first 3 books of the Bible are prehistory. And so that.
the
these
first
are-
one, primal history.
That they are word of mouth, that have been put down on paper at a later date with J and E
And the P writer,
writers.
yeah.
but that they are word of mouth until there was actually historical documentation taking place. So, that can be an element to this.
But before
I-
this is written, Gilgamesh is written. Gilgamesh, it's one of my favorite. It's Mesopotamian. Sort of very, very similar to the Bible. Very, very similar story. Gilgamesh and his buddy Enkidu, the two of them go out and they have these adventures, and you'll hear Jesus and you'll hear God and you'll hear, of course, it's a pagan story. But I'm not positive, I'm not positive that everything I read, because think how many times, and we're only in Exodus 11 now. How many times have we heard, exactly, how many times have we heard, okay, we're changing the story a little bit. We're gonna change this a little bit. We're going to redact this. We're gonna add this. And we'll see the story
People
that,
didn't read and write then.
no,
They were illiterate, completely illiterate. There was no.
some people believe, now you have to picture this almost 2,000 years, that Jay was writing in the court of Solomon or King David, 2,000 years later. And these were stories. Tom used to love to tell this story when he came, before he got sick. These were campfire stories. And if we look at those campfire stories, we'll see they're in every civilization. the Quechua, you know, the Eskimos, the same kind of stories, and we have assigned them. You know, I think it's a little different when we get, we'll see as we go through, we'll see how we change. But getting back to.
So if the stories are the same regardless of the, you know,
The
culture in which they were brought, what causes them to be the same is the same God.
Well, you
who
look
is
up at the
putting it all
star
in
and
there.
you see 7 stars up there, right? The Big Dipper. Big Dipper. Well, those 7 stars show up in every, well, depending on what side of the world you're on, but they show up because people see them and they make stories about them, and they show up everywhere. And there's no water here, and there's too much water there, and there's not this, but and that is certainly something anthropologically. How do we see these stories? Theological scientists will do what we just did, kind of look at it that way, red tide and sandstorms, that sort of thing. But getting back to this 10th plague, do you see it as something that could just happen scientifically? We're not gonna go into the reason for most of these plagues that only affected the Egyptians and why the Israelites were relatively plague-free. But trust me, it's almost impossible to follow and to explain it step by step. So just suffice it to say that it doesn't seem scientific, and it doesn't seem, oh, it's a truck.
Landscaper with a flat tire.
Yeah. So, if the book of Exodus is not science, then what is it? Is it history? Well, here we go. Depends on who you ask, right? Many scholars say impossible to discern what historical events are behind the Exodus, because there is almost a lack of contemporaneous evidence outside of the Bible. There are no extra biblical sources. There are not a lot of stelas and statues. So is any of this true? Is there really evidence for the Exodus? I mean, you will find, I had a professor, absolutely not. There's no, I mean, if you choose to believe it, yeah, and there are people who live their lives exactly believing this. You know, I tend to think we've got to be at least as responsible as God when it comes to killing each other. You know, I think we're pretty good at that. But is there any evidence for the Exodus? And here's what I've come up with. It's true in terms of Egyptian evidence. Okay, there does not seem to be a lot of Egyptian sources. And many scholars say that's intentional, right?
Well, it wasn't their finest hour, why would they keep
Exactly.
history of it?
Why
I mean-
would they? We don't do that to the victors belong.
The spoils.
The
yeah, exactly.
spoil, right? So they're as silent as the Egyptian Sphinx when it comes to telling about their bad experiences. And there simply is no Egyptian written record of the god of the Hebrews beating up on the Egyptian ruler and his subjects. What a surprise, right? And that's not surprising. People in power don't usually record and celebrate in print their humiliations and their defeats at the hands of their inferiors.
But you think 400 years of having some foreign group living in Egypt, there'd be some record of it, or they keeping records?
Yeah, so
1400
far,
BC.
well, there's lots and lots of Egyptian records on the tombs, you know, in the hieroglyphics, lots and lots. And we'll get to that, you know, we talked about, didn't we talk about in here making a mummy yet? Oh God, when do we do that? That took me, we're doing that very soon. So, safe to say, the Egyptians, the Exodus was no big deal for the Egyptians. At least that's not what they want posterity to deduce. So now, very, very different story for the Jews. And who is telling this story?
The Jews.
The Jews. Exactly. Very different story for Jewish people. The Exodus is, without a doubt, the most important event in Jewish history. The Exodus and all the stories that we've been reading that are leading up to the Exodus, the birth of Moses, and Moses talking to the burning bush, and the 10 plagues, all of these events that we're about to read, when they get to the Reed Sea and it parts, and the drowning, yoo-hoo, all those Egyptian soldiers dead, and the giving of the commandments on Sinai, the trip through the desert, all the way to the banks of the Jordan, all of these stories form Jewish identity. And not only in the ancient world, but in our world today. These stories have been told and retold over centuries, over the millennia, for thousands of years. Jews have actually rehearsed these stories of the Exodus. And has anybody here ever gone to a Passover Seder? So you know then, right?
Yeah, not a Jewish one. We had the Seders at our church in Orange Park. We had a Seder where we ate the Passover meal, but it wasn't.
Oh, okay.
Well, I did, at my old church, there was a Lutheran woman who was married to a Jewish man, and they, during Holy Week on Maundy Thursday, came in and did the Jewish Seder, and they did all the Hebrew prayers and everything. They did that, and we had the food, and we had the whole thing, so, yes, we were, but we did it in our church. And but it was historical, and it was a blending of the two faiths, really. And it was so that we could see, what a real Passover celebration of Seder was.
What did the Lutheran guy do?
Oh, they were just there, I mean,
Oh,
they were just
he
there.
didn't tell his story.
No, it was just
The
it was-
Haggadah, everybody had a Haggadah so that you kind of knew what was going on.
We had I don't know what a Haggadah is, but we had a program that had the words written in English.
Okay.
And we-
Interesting.
And our,
Well, Seder,
yeah.
have
Bye.
a good time. Is it doctor?
No.
Oh, good, have fun. Go out to lunch, eat, have a good time. Seder is a Hebrew word, and it actually means order, or arrangement, because you have to do the Exodus story the same way every year in certain order. There are little differences.
And it's the youngest child comes and asks, why does this, why do we do this, and there's 3 different questions and all that stuff, right? Or 3
There's
times
some,
he asks the
yeah,
same question.
sure.
Yeah.
The oldest child again, oldest child
No,
again.
youngest
go,
child,
yeah.
it's the youngest child in this
Oh.
case.
Well, the 4 of them, yeah, the one that asks, it's a very, very interesting, and of course, different places and different times. Ashkenazic are different than Sephardic because they don't have the same kind of foods. But the songs are in a particular order, the food is served in a particular order with the wine, everybody drinks, all the songs are sung. And it's told with scripture readings from this book. And sometimes there are songs, maybe skits, depending on how clever your family is. And it's the story that we're reading now in the book of Exodus. And it's the story of liberation. So if this is just a story and it's not real history, then what have we been reading? And many scholars answer that by saying this is literature. It's literature. The book of Exodus is great literature. And I think most of us will agree, this is not a sober scientific study, and it's not a historical document, but it is sort of a blend of a lot of different literary genres. It's an epic story and a saga and folklore and legends, and we'll see that there's a lot more poetry and songs. And as always, we're gonna meet the priestly writer, get ready for him. And so we'll get to know the people and the characters and their backgrounds and genealogies and lists of who's who, and still later even more lists of instructions. And then once the Hebrew slaves are allowed to go and worship their God, then the priestly writers give detailed instructions on how they're allowed to worship and what they're allowed to do, and statistics and long, long lists. And you'll see wonderful stories and speeches and legends. So do you think that this book is just a book of legends with no historical accuracy, no archaeological? Well, I don't know if you know a woman by the name of Carol Myers. She's amazing, feminist, biblical scholar. And she writes a lot about women, actually. And she reminds us that the Exodus story is very complicated. And it's not black and it's not white, so it's not truth and it's not fiction. It's not just one or the other. It's both and. And as Lutherans, we're used to that, right? We're used to both and. We're both saints and sinners, and we have law and gospel, and we know we're Lord of all and servants to all. And we need to see this book, Exodus, like you were talking about the Lutheran member, just being a witness to it, seeing it as a collection of metaphors, sort of like a gospel is. The gospel is one version. It's John's version, or it's Matthew's version, or Thomas's version, or Q's version. All different gospels didn't make it all into the New Testament, but it's called memory history, and we all have it with our family, don't we? You have brothers or sisters, history of our past, but it's different because most family history is really by second or third generation. They're kind of out the door. New ones take over. But this history in this book has lasted much longer, so it's more of a book of collective memory experiences and very traumatic experiences. And we can date it somewhere around the 1200 BCE. Some say earlier, some say later. But what do we know for sure about the Exodus? What do we think we know for sure? Well, we think that there were a lot of people in Egypt from all over the lands of Canaan, and some of them were enslaved at some time or another. We're pretty certain of that. And we know from documented evidence. Ta-da! We finally have some written documents that were just recently discovered called the Amarna letters, A-M-A-R, Amarna letters. And we read that there were Canaanite chiefs. They called themselves kings, but they weren't kings. And we met them before, way back in Genesis, with Abraham and his nephew Lot. And these chiefs would get together and they would offer their own people as slaves to the Egyptian authorities in order for them to stay in good graces with their more powerful authorities living next door. And we can be certain that during times of extended drought, where do you go to get the food? You go to Egypt because they have the Nile, right? Because of the dependability of the Nile, flooding on schedule, Egypt was less susceptible. It happened occasionally, but not as often, crop failures. And as we know from reading that whole Joseph saga, measures were taken to store and siloed grain that was made available during lean years. So, says the professor, when the famine was over in Egypt, it's not difficult to believe that now these people would want to leave and they'd want to go home. And that's the story that we're reading here. Maybe, right? They want to go home, and it may not be historically accurate or scientifically grounded in hard data. It may be more of a theological, like you have a very strong theological belief that God instituted every single, even though he contradicts himself about 1 billion times. He does this, he doesn't do that. Yet, but here's what I think of people who we'll call Israelites were in Egypt, and now they want out. They want to get out. And that never could have happened without supernatural intervention. That's divine intervention. Yeah, God has a way, right, of making things possible. God controls nature. I totally agree with that. And especially God controlled the heart of Pharaoh, and God did all this so that God could provide freedom for his people. And that's what happened. Some slaves left Egypt and they found freedom with the help of God, and they never forgot because they relive it every single year by performing these lists of rituals. So is this story true? Well, we'll think about that next week when we get to chapter 12. And I'm skipping, but we'll come back. Chapter 12, look very, very carefully and see if you agree with some of the rabbis when they say that the celebration of this story takes place at a table every year at the Passover Seder, which is the celebration dinner. And some people connect it with Pasqua, right?
With what?
Pasqua, which is the Latin word for Easter.
Oh.
We put it right in there, right? So I'm skipping, and next week we'll talk about rosary beads and how we kind of used all of those. But in the meantime, we'll stop now, talk about Christian nationalists. This is all interesting, very, very interesting. But in any case, Shavua Tov, which means have a healthy, wonderful, and get ready for a happy, crazy trip through Exodus 12. It's a very, very full chapter. So do you have any questions now about what we just read? And please, just send me 4donna4@gmail.com. And thank you, I'm not going to say who because you asked me not to say who, but it was a wonderful question. Thank you.